Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Clockwork Heirloom. Holly Arnold had always been fascinated by clocks and watches, a passion inherited from her late grandfather, Frederick Arnold, the Isle of Wight's most renowned watchmaker. Frederick's shop, Arnold Timekeepers, had been the heart of Cowes for over half a century, its worn wooden door and fogged glass window concealing a treasure trove of antique timepieces. It was here that Holly spent most of her childhood, watching her grandfather repair clocks with intricate precision. After Frederick's passing, the shop was left to her. Holly had taken it over without hesitation, finding solace in the rhythmic ticking of the clocks that had once been her grandfather's life. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills of the Isle, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Holly stumbled upon something she had never seen before, a small, tarnished chest hidden in the back of her grandfather's workbench. Inside, nestled among layers of dusty velvet, lay an ancient pocket watch. The metal was blackened with age, its once ornate engravings barely visible. Holly held it up to the light, noticing how unusually heavy it felt in her hand. A strange symbol, worn with time, was etched onto the back, a series of interlocking circles surrounding a single eye. Though it was beautiful in a haunting way, the watch wasn't working. Its hands were frozen at 11:43, and the glass face was cracked. Yet something about it called to her, a pull she couldn't explain. Determined to restore it, Holly set the watch on her workbench. She spent hours studying the intricate gears and cogs beneath its delicate casing. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen. Every part seemed impossibly old, yet strangely familiar, as if the watch was tied to her family in some ancient, forgotten way. As midnight approached, she made the final adjustment, winding the watch with a careful twist of the crown. To her surprise, the second hand began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily, ticking in perfect rhythm. A chill crept through the room as the watch began to glow faintly, casting an eerie blue light across the walls. The air grew thick, as though the very atmosphere had shifted. Holly frowned, feeling a strange pressure behind her eyes, a subtle hum vibrating through her bones. She shook her head, dismissing it as fatigue, and glanced at the time. 11:43. The same time it had been stuck at before. She tapped the glass, wondering if the mechanism had malfunctioned, but just as her finger touched the surface, the world around her twisted. The lights flickered, the floor seemed to lurch beneath her, and a deafening silence fell upon the shop. Holly blinked, suddenly aware that everything was wrong. The shop was the same, yet different. The clocks on the walls no longer ticked. The familiar smell of old wood and oil was gone, replaced by the faint scent of burning metal. Outside, the street was shrouded in mist, and the town, usually so lively, was eerily still. She stepped outside, clutching the watch tightly. The fog curled around her ankles as she wandered the narrow streets of Cowes, the buildings looming over her like forgotten monuments. She called out, but her voice seemed to vanish into the void. Then she saw him. At the end of the street stood a figure, barely visible through the haze. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat with a brimmed hat that obscured his face. Holly's heart raced as the figure turned, revealing an old, cracked face mask, like something from a long-forgotten plague era. He said nothing, but his presence sent a jolt of fear through her. She backed away, but the figure followed, each of his steps perfectly in sync with the ticking of the pocket watch in her hand. Panicked, she glanced down at the time. 11:43. It hadn't changed. She spun on her heel and ran, but no matter how far she went, the figure was always behind her, relentless. The streets twisted into a maze, leading her in circles, until she found herself back in front of the shop. She burst through the door, slamming it behind her, and collapsed against the counter, breathless. The figure was gone, but the air inside the shop felt suffocating. Holly's mind raced. What had she done? What kind of watch was this? Suddenly, she heard a soft chime. She looked around, realizing it was coming from the watch. The hands began to move backward. The second hand spun faster and faster, and with each tick, the world around her unraveled. The walls of the shop flickered, replaced by strange, shifting images her grandfather, sitting at the same workbench, fixing the very watch she now held. Then an older image of a man she didn't recognize, dressed in Victorian garb, holding the same watch. The images moved faster, showing each previous owner of the watch in rapid succession, all the way back to a time she couldn't comprehend. Ancient civilizations, strange figures, all tied to this cursed object. The watch wasn't just broken, it was controlling time itself. Holly tried to stop it, but the gears inside the watch kept spinning. The ticking grew louder, echoing in her skull. She could feel herself slipping away, as if the watch was draining her, pulling her into its twisted reality. Desperate, she yanked the crown, hoping to stop the movement. The ticking stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence once more. For a moment she thought she was safe, but then she heard it, a soft whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was her grandfather's voice, calling her name. Holly, she turned toward the sound, and there, standing in the doorway, was her grandfather. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, and his body flickered like a projection from another time. You shouldn't have touched it," he whispered. "The watch, it binds you to the others?" Holly stammered, backing away. Frederick nodded slowly. "We are all trapped, Holly, every one of us who has ever owned that watch. Time is not what you think it is. It's a prison, and you've inherited the key." She glanced at the watch in her hand, realizing that it wasn't just an heirloom, it was a curse, passed down through generations. "I can't escape it," she whispered. Her grandfather's ghostly figure flickered once more. "No, but perhaps you can control it." Before she could ask what he meant, the figure vanished. The walls creaked, the clocks resumed their ticking, and outside the fog began to lift. But Holly knew things would never be the same. She looked down at the watch, its hands once again frozen at 11:43. Time was hers now, twisted, broken, and terrifying. As the clocks in the shop continued their rhythmic ticking, Holly Arnold, the last in a long line of timekeepers, realized she was no longer a mere watchmaker. She was the keeper of something far darker, something that could never be fixed. And the clock was still ticking. Tick, tock. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious glances at the watch, which never left Holly's side. She tried locking it away, hiding it in the deepest drawer of her grandfather's desk, but every time she did, she'd find it somehow return to her workbench, waiting. The air around the watch hummed with an invisible, sinister energy, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, Holly couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. The vision started soon after. There would come suddenly glimpses of times and places that didn't belong to her. A Victorian ballroom, the flicker of gas lamps casting shadows on masked dancers, a medieval battlefield, thick with the stench of blood and smoke, a desolate landscape, barren and cold, where the sky hung low and colourless. Holly would blink, and the shop would return, but the sensation of having been somewhere else lingered. One night, while she sat in the dim light of her workshop, her hands trembling as she worked on a simple wristwatch, the air grew cold again. The familiar feeling crept over her, the world becoming heavy and distant. The hands on the pocket watch, which lay beside her, began to move on their own. This time they moved forward. Tick, tick, tick. Holly's breath hitched as the ticking grew louder, faster. The shop around her seemed to blur, the walls vibrating with the pulse of the watch. She tried to stand, but her legs gave way. She fell to the floor, gripping the edge of the workbench, her heart racing as the ticking became deafening. Suddenly she was no longer in the shop. Holly found herself standing in the middle of a vast, open field. The sky above was a deep, a natural purple, the clouds swirling like smoke. The air smelled of rain and ozone, but there was no sound, no birds, no wind, just a suffocating silence. In the distance she saw something that made her blood run cold. Figures. Hundreds of them, standing perfectly still, their backs to her, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore tattered medieval armor, others Victorian gowns, and still others modern clothes like hers. But they were all wrong, unnaturally tall, their limbs too long, their heads hanging at odd angles. They stood as if waiting for something. Holly's pulse raced as she felt the weight of the watch in her pocket, burning against her leg. The figures in the distance began to turn, one by one, their movements slow and deliberate. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The first figure to fully face her was dressed in an old military uniform, its face covered by a plague mask, identical to the one she had seen on a man in the fog. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and suddenly they all began to move slowly at first, but with increasing speed, their long limbs carrying them toward her with horrifying grace. She turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest, the field stretching endlessly before her. The figures were gaining on her, their movements impossibly fast, the sound of their footsteps merging with the relentless ticking of the watch in her pocket. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the damp grass, and in that moment she realized there was no escape. They were closing in, their distorted bodies casting long shadows across the ground, their faces expressionless and cold. Just as the first figure reached out to touch her, the world twisted again. Holly was back in the shop, gasping for breath, her heart pounding as though it would burst from her chest. The watch was in her hand, its glass cracked again, her hands frozen once more at 11:43. Her hand shook as she dropped it onto the workbench, the metallic clink sounding like a gunshot in the silence. She stood up, backing away from the watch as though it were a living thing. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice shaking, but there was no answer, only the ticking of the other clocks on the walls. Over the next few days, Holly tried everything to rid herself of the watch. She wrapped it in heavy cloth and threw it into the sea, watching it sink beneath the waves. But when she returned to the shop, it was there, sitting on her workbench, gleaming as though it had never touched water. She took it to an old church at the edge of town, speaking to the elderly priest who had known her grandfather. He blessed the watch, muttering prayers over it in Latin, but even he could not hide the fear in his eyes. When she left, the watch felt heavier than before, its ticking louder in her ears. In desperation, Holly reached out to a historian who specialized in occult artifacts, a woman named Dr. Eliza Harker. They met late one evening in the back of the shop, the place now filled with shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Dr. Harker was an imposing woman with sharp eyes and a cold demeanor, but even she hesitated when Holly placed the pocket watch in front of her. "This isn't just any timepiece," Dr. Harker said, her voice low. "It's a vessel, a conduit for something far older than time itself." "What do you mean?" Holly asked, her throat dry. Dr. Harker leaned closer, her fingers brushing the surface of the watch. "It's tied to a force that manipulates time and reality, those who possess it. They're not meant. It's been passed through the hands of many, but no one survives for long. Time warps around them. They become lost." Holly swallowed hard. "How do I stop it?" "You can't," Dr. Harker said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's too late for that. The watch has chosen you." A cold wave of dread washed over Holly as the weight of the truth settled in. The watch wasn't something to be fixed or discarded. It was bound to her, and her fate was sealed. But as she looked at the cracked face of the heirloom, a strange calm came over her. If she couldn't escape it, maybe she could use it. For the first time, she considered the possibility of controlling the watch, bending its power to her will. She had inherited it for a reason, after all. She was the last of the Arnold timekeepers, and this was her legacy. With a steady hand, Holly picked up the watch, feeling its unnatural warmth seep into her skin. The hands began to move again, ticking softly. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Take me." Then the world unraveled once more. This time, Holly didn't run. She let the darkness take her, knowing she was no longer a victim of time. She was its master. Tick, tock. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.